Oslo Business Symposium 2004.
Okay.
Today's program will be conducted partly in English and partly in Norwegian. Så la oss like gjerne starte på norsk. Vi hørte Hemsingsøstrene. De spilte fransk barokk av Jean-Marie Leclerc, en sonate. Elbjørg er 14 år, Ragnhild er 16. De har vunnet internasjonale priser, nasjonale priser, og de har vært på TV. Jeg er sikker på at vi vil høre mer fra dem i tiden fremover. Lykke til med fremtiden! Mine damer og herrer, vi har et tøft program i dag. Hovedtaler før lunsj er selvfølgelig Michael Porter. Men efter lunsj vil vi også høre Jens Ultveit Moe, Henrik Madsen fra Den Norske Veritas, Berit Svendsen fra Telenor, og Nils Skutle fra Rosenborg, og Jakob Skram fra Statoil. Og vi vil ha en paneldebatt, hvor Siv Jensen er til stede, Gerdli Walla, Inge Hansen, og finansminister Per Christian Foss. But ladies and gentlemen, now please welcome our Minister of Trade and Industry, Børge Brende. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I was then persuaded to talk English to you today. It's a little strange, but in respect of Professor Porter, I try my best. Dear Professor and ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to thank the Christiana-lauget for taking this important initiative. Usually a conference about being competitive in Norway is about sports. This time it is about how to make Norway more innovative and being more competitive in the fields of business. And nothing is more relevant. Definitely is the core of also having a possibility to keep our welfare system and welfare state in the future. It's a prerequisite for us to succeed in the business sector, also for keeping up such a good country that we are today. Winston Churchill once said that the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And at a time like this, maybe it's also relevant to look 100 years back. And 100 years back, Norway was among the poorest countries in Europe, if not the poorest. Today, we're not doing too bad. So something we have had to done the right way the 100 years that has gone. We are indeed a small country, but when it's up to the economy, we're not that small. We're the 23rd largest economy in the world. And this is a result of hard work and also having had a good strategy. We was even doing very well before 72 when we discovered, 71, 72, when we discovered oil. We had a huge growth during the 60s. We are today the third largest exporter in the world of oil and gas. We are, in fact, the sixth biggest producer of hydropower in the world. And we have a lot of competence connected to these fields also. I'm coming shortly back to that. We are also the third largest exporter of seafood. Little Norway. And we are also, in fact, with Telenor. And I'm not just saying that because my ministry is owning more than 50% of the stocks in the company. Telenor is now the 8th biggest GSM operator in the world. And we are, not at least, the 5th biggest shipping nation in the world. And these are facts. I'm not bragging about this. This you can find in the statistics, and it's probably one of the reasons also why we are in a very fortunate position to make policy on how to also keep these comparative advantages in the future. We know that we also have a lot of young people going through higher education, one of the highest figures in the world. For some weeks ago, I visited a company that you might know about, Schlumberger, globally with 60,000-70,000 employees. They lately have now moved part of their one part of their company to Norway because they said that it's so there are good conditions for doing that kind of business in Norway with 100 employees because well-educated people is very competitive in Norway. The wages for civil engineers are the most competitive ones in Europe. And maybe we should have some more enthusiasm around the conditions that we have in Norway that is also really competitive. I think in the future we need to get more knowledge out of oil and gas, hydro and other strongholds. The other day I was leading a Norwegian delegation of business people to China. And I was there also present during signing of a lot of important contracts and MOUs. And one of them was this Norwegian architect firm that you might have heard about, Snøhetta. They have also now succeeded in winning a competition about building new ecological houses in China. And they're going to be built quite a few of them. At the same time, they were winning and they are now a part of building out Ground Zero in New York. This is showing that also in the field of competence and knowledge, we have possibilities in the future. And especially, I think, innovation and knowledge and R&D is crucial. Because in these sectors, you don't only compete on price, you compete on the uniqueness of your product. I was in a very fortunate situation also to give out a prize to the most innovative businesses in Norway for some time ago. And one of the companies that won the second prize was a firm that I know quite well, and I was not on the board that selected them. I was just giving them the prize. It was Aqualyng. It's a small company from my home constituency in Trøndelag. And what is their business? Yes, they are big in desalination, getting salt water into fresh water. And a lot of firms do that globally because there is 1.3 billion people lacking adequate drinking water globally. But the uniqueness in their project is that they reduce the amount of energy you have to use in this process dramatically. And the product, their machine, is much more, cost a lot more than the other ones on the market, but people are willing to pay more because the most important and most expensive input into this machine is the use of energy. So having a knowledge base, you can take an interest out of this knowledge base. And I hope that we can use the comparative advantage we have in Norway in the fields of shipping, in the marine sector, in the maritime sector, and oil and gas sector, and the hydro sector in the future, also to develop these clusters so it also can be an important part of the growth in the private sector that we need. And oil and gas, there is a misunderstanding that oil and gas is almost only about it's raw materials and natural research that is not sustainable. No, we see that Norwegian companies are doing very well globally in exporting the knowledge we have in this field. When you're talking about CO2 sequestration globally, who is then asked when we talk about how to deal with produced water that is coming out also from the drilling, who has made the necessary techniques to handle this, it is Norway. And when the Russians are now building out the Stockman area in the Barents Sea, who has been drilling in Arctic areas on deep water? It is Norway. We are now in Angola. We are also asked for doing this in the Caspian Sea. We are asked about doing this also in Morocco. So these are the possibilities if we know how to use these opportunities to also develop our industry. There are VOC emissions coming out from the oil and gas sector. We have the leading technique in the world how to reduce the VOC emissions. And in the shipping sector, we know that ballast water, and IMO is taking this more seriously because it can pollute. Who has the technique how to clean ballast water? It's Norwegian companies around our coast that can be there and compete. And using our comparative advantages because we have the amount and of knowledge and the amount and the size that is necessary in this field to develop this knowledge. So I am extremely pleased that Professor Porter will address us here today, say something about the possibilities we have in Norway. Of course, this is, if we're going to succeed, we also in the future have to build on what we have succeeded in, but we also have to have a playing level field for business in Norway. That's why we're reducing taxes, to have a playing level field. That's why we're now using more money on research in this government. That's why we also are putting up seed money in next year's budget. And that's why we're now paying so much more attention also to higher education and the schooling system. So I hope you all will then really get a lot out of this day and will be inspired. So Norway also in 100 years' time can be one of the leading economies in the world, and also so we can keep our welfare state. It's up to you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Børge, for this introduction. I hope you can be with us till you have to move up to the King's Palace later on this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School doesn't need any introduction. You all know him, but perhaps you haven't met him. Here he is. Michael Porter, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to have a short, concise introduction without too many bells and whistles. But we have so little time this morning to talk about quite an important subject at this particular moment in history for this particular country. And so I'm glad to have the time. I'm glad to have had a chance to spend a little bit of time with you, Minister. I think a lot of things that are being done in Norway are absolutely on target, and I'll talk about some of those later on. Having said that, I'd like to take the perspective of your friendly outside advisor and really from a data and analytical point of view, see if I can't contribute to some understanding of really two things this morning. First of all, how do we think about modern competitiveness? What really creates the competitiveness of nations and regions? What are the evolving realities of the global economy? Why are countries able to sustain and grow their prosperity? So one of my objectives this morning is to get us all thinking about really the fundamental underpinnings of economic success and how that relates to many of the other things that you do in a country, like your social system, like your education system, like your macroeconomic policies. I think it's very important that in any country that citizens and particularly business leaders really have a shared perspective of what it takes for the nation to win. Because one of the problems I see all around the world is there's so many different perspectives that that really paralyzes change. So one of my goals is to talk about this subject in more general terms. But I've had a chance, because I've known Norway now and have been working around and in and about Norway for more than a decade, and because I am the co-chair of the Global Competitiveness Report that's issued every year by the World Economic Forum, and that's based on in-depth data about 104 different countries, including Norway, I also have a lot of thoughts about just where Norway stands right now in this moment in history. And so as I'm talking about competitiveness, I'd also like to talk about Norway. Now, I understand that there's at least some of you that are Swedes or from other parts of the region. You'll see on many of the slides that I'm going to show this morning and this afternoon, you'll see your own countries. And I may make a few comments about some of the other Scandinavian countries because I think they help reveal some of the questions and challenges and issues and strengths that Norway has. But I'm going to focus primarily on Norway, and I'm going to be very open. And I hope that nobody misinterprets that as lack of concern or caring about Norway. It's absolutely the opposite. I've gotten to know many Norwegians over the years. I have many friends, and so this really comes from a friend. And so hopefully, whenever I say something a little uncomfortable, you'll remember that it's coming from a friend. Okay. I think, at the first level, as we look at Norway, there's a lot of good news. The headline that was picked up in Scandinavia last week when we released the report this year was, Scandinavia is leading. And Norway actually ranked number 6 on the growth index that was featured as kind of the number 1 story in most of the articles here in Scandinavia and also around the world. And Norway indeed is in a good, strong, robust position in many respects. The level of prosperity is very, very high. Many of the fundamental things that you want in a prosperous economy, like a very well-educated population, good infrastructure, good, sound legal system, all those things are very much present. And Norway has an enormous capital base. It's very sound fiscally. And so a lot of the news is good. But I think if you start to peel away from that good news and start to dig below the surface, I think this actually proves to be a particularly dangerous time in the history of Norway. It's kind of a period of inflection. Because we've had a boom, really, in oil prices over the last few years. We're feeling very prosperous. On the other hand, the underlying indicators, in some significant respect, are actually deteriorating, and we'll talk about that later. And, of course, we face the impending inevitable transition, away from an extractive, hydrocarbon-based export economy. It's very hard for countries to really make changes before they have to. I've seen that happen very, very few times. So the question is, can the Norwegian private sector, working with government, make necessary changes before they have to? I think that is the fundamental moment that we have now. And in some ways, I think this discussion has been going on now for at least 10 years. I can remember being here before, years ago. I can remember some of the same issues being raised. And my own assessment is that the improvement and change since 10 years ago has been incremental. I don't want to say there's been no progress. There's been progress, but it's been incremental. The fundamentals still haven't really have been addressed. And I think that it's very hard to address those fundamentals in a democracy where you don't have a problem, where actually things are looking better every year. where the Global Competitiveness Report lead story is, we're number 6, we're doing very well. So how do we first of all understand truly where Norway stands? And then perhaps in the second part of this morning, what do we need to do? And perhaps then, how do we do it? How do you achieve the consensus necessary to do so? We'll talk about that later on. Now, although the Global Competitiveness Report really highlighted the positive dimensions of the growth prospects of Norway, I think if you actually look at the data, Norway's economic growth has actually not been particularly rapid. You see the ranking of Norway among the kind of leading peer countries that we've chosen to look at in this presentation. Norway's really near the bottom. Italy's a mess. I was in Italy yesterday. Italy's in deep trouble right now. Germany is completely stalled out. Japan has been in a 12-year slump, and Switzerland is frozen in inability to do anything. And that's the league that you're in terms of economic growth. Some of the other leading Scandinavian economies, Denmark is just a little bit better. Sweden and Finland have actually had much more dynamism in terms of economic growth. So why is that? What's going on? If we look at the growth and prosperity, which the broadest measure of prosperity is GDP per capita, again, Norway is at a very high level. That's the good news. The problem is that we're growing at a very slow rate. We're growing down there with the Germanys and the Japans, not with the Finlands, the Swedens, the Spains, the Greeces, the South Koreas, the Irelands, the people, even the UK, which has traditionally been seen as really not a very rapidly growing country in terms of prosperity, I think is doing a lot better than we are. And then, of course, there's the oil. And I think we all kind of understand that oil is sort of the engine that's been pulling a lot of our economic statistics. And if you pull out the extractive exports, that is just the oil itself, the oil and gas, not all the high-tech services that the minister was talking about, but if you kind of adjust for the oil exports themselves, and ask how would our GDP per capita look if we didn't have oil exports that were growing in value because of the oil price, well, we're not even growing our prosperity at this point. I think we'll see over and over again that we can get fooled if we're not very careful looking at these standard economic statistics. We can get fooled about what's really happening that is going to affect the next 100 years as opposed to the last 100 years. Now, how do we really understand the prosperity of a country and how that prosperity is growing or shrinking or keeping up or falling behind? Well, I think we know some very fundamental lessons now that are now, it used to be controversial, now I think it's pretty well accepted. We know that prosperity in any nation is fundamentally driven by the productivity with which that nation can operate its economy. If you're productive, if you can generate a lot of output value per day of work, you can support a high wage. You can support high returns to capital. If you're not productive, you are going to have to get by with a lower wage. Productivity determines prosperity. There's a very, very strong linkage. You can do better than your productivity for a little while if you're lucky, if you have a windfall, but eventually your productivity is going to determine your wealth. And the more global the economy becomes, the more the international economy becomes integrated, the more that's true. Those nations that can provide a productive platform for business do well, continue to grow rapidly. Those nations that can't are feeling inexorable pressures on their standard of living. Now, in order to grow productivity over time and support rising prosperity, you've got to have innovative capacity. You've got to have a country that has the dynamism, the vitality to come up with new ideas, new products, new processes. Because if all you're doing is producing standard products with standard processes, we know there's lots of other lower cost places to do business. The work will go there. So for an advanced economy like Norway, we have to operate at very high levels of uniqueness and innovation and skill and technology. And that's absolutely true for the United States as well, and for Japan, and for the other very advanced economies in the world. So this is kind of the inexorable iron ladder. You know, prosperity is what we hope we have. To get that, we've got to be very productive, and in order to drive that productivity, we've got to build innovative capacity. And innovative capacity is not just science and technology. It's really the creative act of entrepreneurship. New things get created. Sometimes a new thing is not a scientific thing. Sometimes a new thing is a new innovative, internet product idea or a new way of marketing. All those things really drive productivity growth and ultimately support a rising standard of living. Now, in terms of productivity growth, again, Norway looks, sort of okay if you just look at the data, unadjusted. But if you again try to back out the effect of the hydrocarbon exports, which really boost the value per worker in Norway, and there's a relatively small number of workers actually involved in that, you see that actually productivity growth is zero in the Norwegian economy over the last 5 years. And this is a real problem. It means that your vulnerability is rising. And that can't happen. Norway can't stop the forces of the global economy. It can't stop the reallocation of work. It can't stop Norwegian companies from moving out if this is not a productive place to do business. And therefore, this is really a danger sign. Now, in addition to that, we've got some other kind of issues that I think you all know much more about than I do. We're really not utilizing the labor force in Norway very, very much. The hours worked are very low. Now, some people say, well, that's good, isn't it? That means we can, we're wealthy, we can take time off. We Americans get accused of overwork, and that's probably true. And if it were just that everybody was taking time off and that was part of a productive choice that people were making, then it would be less of an issue. But actually, if you look at that data, part of the reason for that is too much sick leave, too many people on disability. So there's a lot of people not participating in the labor force, which is ultimately, I think, eroding the productive capacity of the country. That's okay now. That's fine. We're able to support a pretty good standard of living, but it raises a red flag for the future. And ultimately, I think that issue will be addressed one way or another. We also see that costs in Norway, the cost of doing business, the cost of living, is relatively high. Here we use the purchasing power parity adjustment factor that macroeconomists use to kind of compare economies. And this factor really measures the extent to which local cost levels are high or low relative to other countries. And although Norway is not unusually versus the other Scandinavian countries, I think for all of the Scandinavian countries, we've got a situation where domestic costs are too high. There's inefficiencies in the domestic sector. This is the restaurants and the transportation systems and the wholesaling and the construction and things like that, again, are not a problem now. But this is really what sunk Japan. Japan didn't go down because its export sectors were threatened. Toyota's doing better than ever. Canon's doing better than ever. Japan sunk because the cost of doing business in Japan and the cost of living was so high that nobody wanted to invest in Japan, not even Japanese companies. And they put all their capital outside. And they built very strong global multinational positions, but ultimately Japan was really starved of investment. And combine that with very little entrepreneurship, there was very few new companies being formed in Japan. You got a situation where Japan has had a 12-year siesta, I mean, in terms of economic vitality. And they're coming out of it now unmistakably, but look at how long it took. See, the Japanese case is a very interesting case for you to consider. Here's a country that was on the top of the world. All the books were, Japan is number one. Japan was seen as this unstoppable economic engine. But underneath the surface, there was some stuff going on, and what they were doing was unsustainable. Look at how long it's taken them to make the adjustment in a system that politically is very not effective. I mean, the Japanese political system is not responsive. Japanese politicians don't feel very accountable to their voters. And they don't feel very accountable to anybody. They just kind of have a lot of discussions within the Liberal Democratic Party. And they decide what they think is right. And it's all this complicated coalition of the farmers and the rural guys, and they just couldn't get anything done. It took them 12 years to get anything done. And Minister Takanaka, who's a good friend of mine, the Minister of Finance basically, or economy, and who was in charge of trying to deal with the debt problems that everybody knew there was these problems, but they didn't do anything about it. And the minister was getting death threats, for trying to have bad loans treated as bad loans. So, here's what happens when you're in a country where things look good, they feel good, there's some underlying weaknesses, but everybody goes into denial, and nobody wants to do anything. And I think this is a very interesting lesson of how long it can take to sort out your economic difficulties if you find yourself in a situation like that. Now, there is a bright spot in Norway on innovative output. Norway is starting to generate a relatively rapid growth in patenting. The measure we use is U.S. patenting, because any important technology for commercial purposes is going to be patented in the U.S. because the U.S. is the world's largest market, and still, even though China is growing. The U.S. patent system really sets the bar for best in the world. To get a U.S. patent, you basically have to be best in the world. You have to be really unique. So we like to use U.S. patents. It's a tough measure of innovation, but it's a very valid measure, we find. And Norway is at a relatively low level, and I think this is well recognized here and a big problem. You're at a low level, but you're growing rapidly. And this is one of the few places where Norway is really in the right place on the chart. And that's good, but I think there are some challenges with science and technology and the R&D system that still need to be addressed. That's suggested by this next slide, which says that although R&D spending is rising in Norway, the effectiveness of R&D spending, the patent output per unit of R&D input is actually relatively low compared to the other Scandinavian economies and the leading innovative economies of the world. So we got a long way to go on this innovation stuff. We're moving in the right direction, but we got a long way to go. Our trade position in Norway overall looks quite stable. In fact, there's been a modest increase in Norway's world market share over the last 5 or 6 years, but if you look at actually where it's coming from, it's a little bit troubling. Look at the yellow. That is the non-oil goods exports. And the non-oil goods exports are actually losing share in Norway. The oil exports are gaining share. Oil exports now account for about 60% of total goods exports. Services exports are pretty robust because Norway has some really strong clusters in the marine area in particular, which are supporting a very nice, stable position in service exports. But on the goods side, again, we have some signs for concern. This next chart is about inward foreign direct investment. As we'll see later, if you're going to have a productive economy in the year 2004, you've got to have a healthy mix of local companies and foreign companies. All the prosperous economies are moving in that direction or already have achieved that. And Norway, for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about later, is really an outlier on foreign direct investment. Now, don't compare yourself to the United States. The United States is a huge economy, so you got to control a little bit for size here. As a relatively small economy, you should have a higher penetration of foreign companies here than a large economy would. And look at Sweden, look at Denmark, way on the right-hand side, higher up on the chart. Look at Finland, way on the right-hand side. And Norway is quite low. And again, we believe that foreign companies are neither good or bad. The ownership, who owns the company, is increasingly not relevant. In fact, it's even hard to tell. Most international companies are owned by lots of people in lots of different locations. The ownership is not what's so important. The importance is what the company chooses to do in your country. And what you want is companies to come to your country to do productive things, to do advanced things, and to feel that your country is a good base of operations. And you have that in the oil and gas cluster, for example. You have some of the world-class players in that cluster, technology companies, here. They're operating here because, boy, this is the place to be. As the minister said, there's some great technology there, some great innovation going on there. But the overall data tell us that there's too few, too little, and this is a real challenge. Particularly, again, as we have to make up for the slowly declining impact of oil. This is an analysis that was done by UNCTAD. I'm not going to stake my professional career on this analysis, but this analysis tries to assess how is a country doing on inward foreign investment relative to its potential. And UNCTAD, this is a UN agency, has a model for predicting inward investment potential based on a number of attributes of a country in terms of like education levels and things like that. And you see Norway is an underperformer. There's something blocking foreign investment from coming here, given what one would expect, given Norway's other assets. And this is a problem because it's going to slow down productivity. In this modern economy, it's very complex. Every industry, every sector involves a lot of ideas, a lot of technologies, a lot of skills. You can't master all those yourself. And so you really need the foreign companies to bring the ideas, to bring the skills, to bring the sophisticated market needs. You can't just develop all that stuff inside. You can't do that anymore. Maybe you could do it 200 years ago when business was artisans, working in a little artisan shop. But you can't do it anymore. The United States can't do it. Japan can't do it. No country can be self-sufficient. You really definitely need foreign investment to be a part of your mix. Doesn't have to dominate, but it needs to be part of the mix. Norway also, as you all know, has relatively few companies that are truly global players. Among the Business Week 1000, Norway has 5. And Denmark only has 4, which is an issue for Denmark, and Finland only has 5, which is an issue for Finland. But I think if you look at Norway's international companies on this list anyway, you see that actually 2 of them, of course, are in the energy area. And then 2 of them are pretty local. And so, they're big, but they're pretty local. And I think if you compared this to a Sweden or even a Finland, you'd see that there may be a small number of companies there too, but boy, they're much more international. So there's something about the ability of Norwegian companies to globalize that seems to be an issue, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay. Now, how do we understand all this? I've given you a number of indicators of really the fundamental productivity and innovative potential of the economy. How do we understand why those indicators are what they are? First thing I think we need to understand is we have to understand the kind of difference between inherited prosperity and created prosperity. You know, inherited prosperity is where your prosperity is derived from selling things that you were endowed with. And in our case here in Norway, it's natural resources primarily. Where your economy is based heavily on inherited prosperity, we know that your prosperity is limited because most of those things that you inherit eventually run out. And we're, of course, facing that situation. That's not bad in and of itself. It's not the fact that you're exporting oil. That's not bad. It's good. You know, it makes you prosperous. The problem is that where you have economies that are based heavily on inherited prosperity, the focus in the economy gravitates towards really not the creation of wealth, but the distribution of wealth. And the various parts of the society see the wealth and they say, okay, I want my share. And you have a political process which tends to be very heavily dominated by, okay, who gets their share? You know, how much should public employees get, and how about each region deserves its share, you know, of the nation's wealth, and so forth. You get into that kind of a discussion. Now, I'm not going to make any comments about Norway, but, you know, you've heard that discussion in this country for many years. Because there's a pie, and the fight is about who to divide it. In a world where inherited wealth is a big deal, particularly natural resources, this thrusts government inevitably into the center of the economy. Because government, of course, controls the inherited wealth. And the other thing is that when you have inherited wealth, and we find this across all countries, I'm not just talking about Norway, the inherited wealth allows you to afford to do things that are not productive. It supports policies that are not productive. Whereas if you don't have anything, if you don't have any inherited wealth, and you just got to create it, then you're much less likely to be in that situation. We find that there's a very strong negative correlation between how much inherited wealth you have as a percentage of your export base and your improvement in competitiveness. Those countries with a lot of natural resources don't tend to improve their competitiveness as rapidly as countries without them. So this is kind of the challenge that Norway faces. Created prosperity is very different. It's created by actually creating products and services that somebody wants and somebody will pay for. At the center of created prosperity is the firm. Firms are the only actor in society that can actually create wealth. Government doesn't create wealth. Macroeconomic policy doesn't create wealth. Only firms can create wealth. And prosperity that's created by firms is truly unlimited. It's unlimited. It's limited only by the imagination, by the dynamism, by the entrepreneurial ability of the firms and the individuals working in those firms in the economy. And where you're focusing on creative prosperity, it's really how do we get the right conditions in place to allow more prosperity to be created, to allow productivity to rise. In some fundamental sense, Norway's got to make the shift from really a lot of attention to the inherited prosperity to fundamentally a riveted attention on the creative prosperity. And it's really hard to do it when you don't have a crisis. Now, how do we create prosperity? Well, we know that to build a productive economy, you need to have sound and stable macroeconomic policies, good social conditions, including environmental conditions, good legal system. All those things are very, very important because they create the stability of the platform on which businesses can actually invest and improve productivity and create wealth. And here Norway is literally a star. You have very sound macroeconomic policies. You have this marvelous oil fund, system, which is really a tremendous achievement. You have great social conditions. You have good basic education. You have a very sound legal system, very highly rated. Very transparent government, very high ratings in terms of fairness of government, not favoring individual firms and so forth. The basic platform is very good. The problem I think that Norway is having is actually taking advantage of that platform and converting it into the dynamism in the business sector. Now, it's not that there's not great things going on in the business sector. I don't want anybody to be offended. I do know a lot of firms here are doing great things, but in total, there's not enough. That's what the data are telling us. We've got to then not just worry about those framework conditions, we've got to worry deeply about what I call the microeconomic foundations of the economy, the underpinnings of the economy, which consist of firms and how good firms are. You can't have a productive economy unless you have productive firms. And productive firms don't exist unless you have the right kind of business environment that surrounds those firms and gives them the right incentives and the right push and the right pressure in order to act in the way they need to be world class. Now, again, many of you are probably familiar with the work that we've been doing over many years now to try to understand what about the business environment supports productivity. This is where the so-called diamond theory comes in. And we know that there's some basic conditions that really allow productivity to rise. The quality of the human resources, the quality of the scientific base, the intensity of competition. You can't compete abroad if you don't have to compete at home. The stringency of demand, if you have demanding local customers, you tend to do much better serving customers in other parts of the world because you're good if you have demanding local customers. We also know that in order to have really high productivity competition, you need clusters. Clusters are where you don't have isolated firms in a particular field. You have a whole cluster of firms that create a critical mass of suppliers and supporting industries and service providers and training institutions and scientific institutes. And this is the oil and gas cluster in Houston. We don't export very much oil anymore. In fact, we don't export any, I don't think. But we export a lot of knowledge, a lot of intellectual capital. And the wages in the Houston oil and gas cluster are extraordinarily high because it's the knowledge, the skill, and the productivity that really supports a high wage, not the resources themselves. Here's another cluster. This is life sciences in Boston. Again, clusters are where you actually get a critical mass of organizations in a particular field that support each other, that compete, but also can jointly cooperate on certain dimensions of the business environment, and where you have the supporting institutions around them that will allow them to get the right kind of people, get the right kind of skills, get the right kind of technology, and drive them forward. It's interesting that when the minister was talking earlier about innovative things going on in Norway, both of the examples that I heard, I may have missed some, but both the examples I heard were from a strong cluster in Norway. One was the oil and gas and energy, which includes the suppliers, all the firms that provide the technology to deal with all this tough stuff in the North Sea. Yeah, is a good example. The North Sea is a very demanding environment. It's a very demanding need in terms of the technology and skill to extract and produce hydrocarbons. And so it's quite logical to see that Norwegian companies would be very good then at mastering these tough challenges. And once they did that, they could go to the Caspian Sea and other places in the world and actually sell that stuff. That's how it works. That's a great example. He gave the example of dealing with bilge water. Shipping cluster, another big successful cluster where there's a critical mass, a lot of sophisticated people looking for ways to push the envelope, to be at the cutting edge of their field. And here innovation pops up. So we find that clusters are not only important for kind of efficiency, but clusters are very important for innovation. the perception of new ideas, the realization of new ideas, the startup of new companies, and there's lots of evidence about that I can talk about a little later. When we look at clusters, we also see the need for an institutional base that surrounds the clusters. And this is just an example from life sciences in Boston. It's not just the firms and the universities that you need. You also need various kinds of organizations that kind of bridge the memberships of the cluster, help build relationships, exchange information, harness technology, perform collective actions, joint research, perhaps joint international marketing, so its institutional fabric is also very important, we find. Now, if these are some of the really underlying drivers of productivity and innovation, again, how is Norway doing? What this slide does is the Global Competitiveness Report really consists of two parts. One part looks at kind of the environment for economic growth in the medium term, and that's where Norway was ranked 6th in the world. The other part of the report looks at the underlying competitiveness of the economy from a business point of view. And on that index, Norway was actually ranked 20. So notice the difference. Medium-term prospects look good, but the underlying competitiveness, productivity potential, lower. What this chart does is it plots the overall index of business competitiveness, which is drawn from about 70 different indicators, into a single index, and it plots that against GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power. And we see that Norway is very high in purchasing power adjusted income. You're very wealthy. But its competitiveness is significantly lower than you would expect given its income. Another way of saying it is, right now, Norway is not earning its income. It's enjoying its income, but it's not earning it. And the next slide shows you kind of the significance of that. Right now, the Norwegian GDP per capita is about close to 50% higher than we would predict it would be based on the underlying indicators of competitiveness. Now, even if you take out the oil, it's still about 20% higher. So, again, I don't want to say that 50% is the right number. Particularly, these numbers are not exact. But I am sure that a significant percent of the GDP per capita is not sustainable right now. Now, we don't have to change overnight. That may be the problem, but right now. But we have time. We can make the right moves, change the trends. But right now, we are in a situation where the standard of living is really not sustainable based on all the evidence that we are able to marshal. On the right-hand side, you see the Growth Competitiveness Index, and that's where Norway was ranked number 6, and that's good. On the left-hand side, you see the Business Competitiveness Index, and you can see the trend isn't particularly good. Now, it's not so much that Norway is falling in absolute terms. It's just that Norway isn't moving fast enough. The bar is rising. Other countries are improving their infrastructure. Other countries are improving their education systems. Other countries are changing their intellectual property laws. Other countries are opening their markets to more international competition. Other countries are busy. And you're not as busy. It's not that nothing's going on. I don't want to overstate this case. It's not that simple. It's not that simple. But it's just not moving enough. And net, the overall trend is pretty unmistakably in the right direction. Now let's look at the company side first. and I have to move quickly because we want to stay on schedule. On the company side, we see what we do is we actually we have 104 countries in the GCR, and these numbers, these ranks, 6 means that of all the companies in the world, the survey data suggests that Norway's companies' willingness to delegate authority is ranked 6th in the world. Delegation authority is good. The bad economies are ones where there's an autocratic person at the top, there's no delegation of authority. That's a kind of indicator of the effectiveness of the organizational process. Extent of staff training. Norway is ranked quite high. And the arrows are where the ranking of the country, in this case Norway, has gone up or down quite a bit in the last 5 years on those questions where we have consistent data. So, Norwegian companies have a pretty good management structure based on our understanding, pretty efficient in terms of their methods of production, good, oriented towards their people, so there's some good things. But, on the weaknesses side, internationalization, big issue. The ability to kind of master the whole value chain. The value chain is the whole set of activities the firm performs, from procurement to logistics to production to marketing to service. Norwegian companies are kind of perceived as being kind of narrower and having less robust skills across the value chain. Extent of incentive compensation. A very much of a more seniority-based structure rather than a structure based on merit and performance. None of this is going to be a surprise to any of you. It shows we got good, solid companies here, but again, these rankings are too low. If you want to be really 6th in the world, you can't have regional sales and internationalization down in the 40s. That's down with the Estonias of this. You're ranked too low in those areas. Got to move those up. Private sector is still too low in R&D investment compared to other Scandinavian economies, compared to the major innovative economies. You all know that. Some signs that this might be changing, but there's been an argument that Norway has low R&D because of the large energy sector. It turns out that a lot of your patenting and innovative activity is in the energy sector, so that's a silly argument. That doesn't make any sense. It's just that we have not yet the companies in Norway have not yet understood that this is the way they have to compete. They've been able to get along okay without making substantial commitments to R&D and technology. Across the board, there's isolated exceptions that prove it can be done, that prove how important it is, but the overall data is clear. This is just the list of the top patenters in Norway of all Norwegian entities. And you see that the top Norwegian patenter is ranked number 19 among the Baltic Sea area companies, and shall we say this is not a great result. We would like to see a few more companies that really are among the innovation leaders in this region, and we don't see enough of that. Now, if we can move to the next slide. In terms of the business environment, time is short, but the overall assessment here, I think, will not particularly surprise you. Very efficient public sector, good legal system, strong IT and communications infrastructure. That area of infrastructure is quite world-class. Physical infrastructure, however, roads, airports, and all that, not bad, but really not world-class. I don't need to comment more. Financial markets, okay, good solid financial markets, but not cutting edge. Not innovative. There's not a lot of private equity here. There's not a lot of really advanced financial instruments. There's not a sense that this is a really innovative financial market, particularly for financing risk. Education and skills are strong, but as we'll see some data later, some emerging issues there that I know many of you are aware about. On the context for competition side, good base, low corruption, good competition laws. Norway tends to get a bad rap sometimes about inflexibility in labor market conditions. The data, as you'll see later, you're not that inflexible, you're fine. I mean, you could be more flexible. You can always be more flexible. That's really important to small companies. When you're starting a company, you really, really don't want to have to stare in the face a kind of vast commitment that you're making to hire somebody. You'd like to hire somebody with the understanding, look, we're going to try this together, we're going to give it our best shot. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And labor market flexibility is really important for that. You can get around it in big companies. They deal with it pretty easily. But it's small companies that it's the real big issue in. Taxation is high. Again, another area where Norway gets a bad score. But actually, compared to a lot of the neighboring countries, it's not, particularly a problem. It needs to go down. Hopefully it needs, because if it doesn't go down and you don't change the other things, it's going to be impossible really to attract investment. But it's not unusually high. The real areas that cause us concern are just a lack of rivalry, the kind of intense rivalry, the limited openness to international competition, which, in a small economy is really, really, really important because you're so small that you're not going to have lots and lots of local companies in many parts of the economy. You need to be very open because that provides the market discipline so that the few local companies do a good job. And that's a big issue. And the government here still has a very large presence in the economy, as we'll see. So let's go more deeply into some of these areas. What I've done here is I'm just giving you a lot of data, and I'm going to, through the host here, we'll make this presentation available to any of you. I'd be delighted to share this with you, and you can look at this more in a more leisurely way. But we're going to give you lots and lots of data on all those indicators that we think and have found based on the actual evidence are important. Some of the strengths that Norway has are quite clear, and you see them. Once again, these rankings are rankings of all the countries in the world, based on, in some cases, hard data, in some cases, survey data of leading executives in the economy. And we survey about 8,500 executives from all over the world to get this data. Good legal framework, pretty efficient government, good IT infrastructure. Those are areas where you're ranked high. Independent government, minority shareholders are protected, low corruption, good bankruptcy, pretty good labor management relations. Very, very important. Hidden trade barriers historically have been seen to be relatively low, but look at the black arrow going down. 14. Not good, particularly for a relatively small economy. Now, when we talk about strengths, we find that there are some misleading perceptions of strengths in Norway. I mean, one of the important things a country needs to do is be honest with itself and have a good self-image about that fits with the data. I think a couple areas where the self-image may not be quite right are education and skills, infrastructure, and financial markets. Yes, Norway is pretty good in terms of education and skills. It does have a fairly high ratio of scientists and engineers in the workforce, very well-educated people, but the share of graduates in science and technology is low and declining significantly. Test scores are only average despite the very high expenditures. So the output of educational attainment per unit of spending is actually quite disturbing. And a lot of companies, are voicing concerns about the quality of the training that the people get that they hire. So, education and training is nothing to be complacent about. in Norway. Infrastructure is good, but only so-so. Financial markets, we've already talked about. This data just shows that in terms of average literacy and attainment in math and science and reading, Norway is far from the top, despite the huge expenditures. Now, again, I already really covered this briefly, so I'll go quickly. I mean, there's also some weaknesses in Norway that are misleading. And I've mentioned the two key areas. In terms of labor market regulation, we actually find that Norway's labor market flexibility is pretty good relative to many countries. Now, of course, we don't have the US on here. We do have the UK, and we see that we're well behind them. But we're much better than a whole lot of other countries, including Sweden, according to this World Bank scoring system, which is really quite rigorously done. So I put some stock into this data. In terms of taxation, this is a very busy slide, but this tries to measure both the incentive effect of taxation and the complexity of the tax system. And Norway is not on the good side of this equation, but it's clearly not in an extremely disadvantaged situation, and it's better than most of the Scandinavian countries and Germany and France and Italy. So I think that we can't really point to this or labor market flexibility as really the fundamental problem right now. We need to really look more broadly than that, and here's some of the areas that really pop up to us. And I'm going to, again, go quickly to try to keep close to our schedule. Foreign ownership restrictions, 46. Centralization of economic policy, too much kind of centralized, top-down government role, 31. Intensity of competition, 28. Tariff liberalization, going down, 26. Efficiency of corporate boards and governance to really make companies accountable, not so hot. This is a chart that shows the relative size of the public enterprise sector. You can see that Norway is way over on the left, where public enterprise is still a very huge force in the economy. But I find even more telling that it's pretty much staying the same. Whereas if you look in Poland, they were really high, but they're moving. Finland moving, Sweden moving, Denmark moving, Norway. Psh. We're kind of stuck on this issue. I remember 10 years ago we were talking about this issue. Big debate, I don't think there's any real tangible evidence that shows that public enterprise doesn't make it more complicated to have productivity. And there's lots of evidence to show that public enterprise crowds out private enterprise and just makes it harder for private enterprise to flourish in those areas where the public enterprise is operating for pretty obvious reasons. So again, this is an issue where we need to take we need to start making some hard choices, but we're not under pressure. So it's really hard to do that. Now, there are some significant, here's product market regulation. So here we are high. It's not so much the labor market, it's the product markets that are overregulated and maybe where competition has been slowed by the large impact of public enterprise. Moving to the demand side, we have some very stringent environmental regulations. That is a source of great competitive strength. Again, the minister used this example of an environmental problem where Norwegian companies were innovators in coming up with a solution that they could then sell around the world. There's your model. That's how it works. If you meet demanding needs with great technology and you have to compete, you'll be world class. But look at on the right-hand side, government isn't really using its purchasing power to really demand cutting-edge technology. The regulatory standards outside of the environmental area, at least are not by the survey data, perceived to be that stringent. Local buyers in Norway are not perceived to be particularly demanding and sophisticated. So this raises some challenges. Yes, we can improve the inputs to innovation. We can spend more on R&D. We can pump money into the supply side, but you really need the demand side for innovation as well. And so this suggests that we really need to get our regulatory house in order. And there's a real weakness in Norway in related and sporting industries and the development of clusters. Although there's a few really world-class clusters, the shipping and marine, the oil and gas, and perhaps smaller in the fishing and fish products and agriculture, that's about it. And this whole notion of cluster development has been perhaps not well developed enough in Norway, and I'll talk a lot more about that in the second part of my session. So what I'd like to do is just leave you here with sort of my summary of where we stand on this slide. And this is really, after our break, where we will start in talking about what needs to be done. Norway has a high level of current prosperity, but this masks some serious weaknesses in our economic performance. And those weaknesses are a reflection of the fact that our fundamental competitiveness is not sufficient to support really a improving standard of living in this country, and it's actually been deteriorating a little bit over recent years. There's a number of weaknesses that we have to be addressed, and we'll talk about that, but I think we also have to figure out, how are we going to get consensus to change? So with that, let me thank you for your attention so far. We're going to take our break, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about what we might do differently going forward. Thank you.
Dear Michael, thank you so much for a brilliant presentation, very relevant to Børge Brende and all other Norwegian politicians and all the business executives in the audience. It would have been fine to have you here for days to discuss these very important issues of Norway's future. That's not possible because the Harvard Business School needs you back. But at least after the break, ladies and gentlemen, Michael will be back. Mine damer og herrer, the show must go on. It has been made a new report on Norway. Here you have it. Norway from a northern star to a falling star. Carried out by Torgeir Reve and Knut Hånes. Torgeir Reve, the president of BI, the Norwegian School of Management, and Knut Hånes, the director of the Norwegian Research Council. You are waiting for Michael Porter? Yes, please, Michael, would you please come in? And listen to Torgeir Reve. The floor is yours.
Competitive advantage of nations. Okay. When Michael Porter published his Competitive Advantage of Nations book in 1990, it did not contain any case study of Norway. That was probably a mistake. I read the pre-publication draft of the book at the time, and I was a bit skeptical because of the data used. But after the publication of the book, some Norwegian business leaders came to me and proposed to do a Porter study of Norway. And in business manner, they asked how much would it cost. So I paused and said $1 million and thought they would go away. But they accepted. And so the first Norwegian Porter study was underway. In 1992, this book came out. It was called Et konkurransedyktig Norge, Competitive Norway. And it concluded that Norway had 3 industrial clusters: the maritime, the oil, energy, and seafood. And we had better data than in the original data in Michael Porter's book. I started myself to be confident in his findings of the role of clusters, although our findings at the time were controversial, and there was lots of debate in the aftermath of the study. Now, 10 years later, 2 new Norwegian business leaders came to me and suggested we should do a follow-up study. Of course, the price had doubled, but we got the funding, and in 2002, my second book on industrial competitiveness of Norway came out at Verdiskaper Norge, a value-creating Norway. Our methodological approach had improved a lot, and so had our data. We had, for instance, added economic performance data for 10,000 Norwegian companies for 10 consecutive years. Again, 3 strong industrial clusters emerged: energy, maritime, and seafood. And we found emerging clusters in network industries such as the telecom, finance, and retailing. And the role of innovations in clusters were strong. In the meantime, dozens of different cluster reports had appeared in Norway, ranging from local industry analysis, regional cluster studies, to large international benchmarking reports. The research evidence accumulated, and the Porter concepts became part of everyday language among politicians and business leaders. And although some people sometimes call it reveklynger rather than clusters. What we would like to explore further today is what are the policy implications of the industrial cluster studies as applied to Norway. In Norway, the debate on economic policy toward business is a bit strange. There is tremendous concern about industry neutrality, and the danger of rent-seeking is always added. So policy implications are still unclear. By the way, Norwegians have some superb economists. I've calculated we have 10% of the Nobel Prize in economics, including this year's Nobel Prize to my old neighbor, colleague, and friend, Finn Kydland. In fact, I was with Birger Brende in China when he got the prize, and the Chinese sitting next to me immediately calculated, okay, you have 0.1% of the population, 10% of Nobel Prizes, you must be 100 times as competitive in economics. Now, whether or not that works for what we have discussed today, I'm a bit uncertain, because the most famous Norwegian economies are dealing with macro issues. And I think you heard Michael Porter today talking about the micro determinants of industrial competitiveness and innovation. So what we have decided to do today is to get some assistance from Michael Porter himself to solve this puzzle about what to do in the policy arena. So we have prepared this case study of Norway, titled Norway from Northern Star to Falling Star, ? Knut?
Thank you, Torgeir. In the case, we are basically saying that, as has been said earlier today by Michael Porter, Norway is in a privileged situation. We have a high value creation, we have financial strength, and we have a high employment. But we shouldn't forget that the stars 10, 15 years back, countries like Germany and Japan, couldn't rest on that position. The positive for Norway is, of course, that we have both the time and the resources to do something about it. And that's what we are trying to address in the case. Actually, by looking at the issue of competitiveness, we are forced to look into the future. Of course, the temptation was there once we knew that Michael Porter was coming to write a case. I think Michael Porter and, of course, Harvard Business School is the embodiment of the case method. And today we wanted the expert opinion, and we wanted Michael Porter to solve the case of Norway. We actually wanted to write the case in order to push the discussion from analysis to solutions, and that's what we're going to try to do in this session. Let me just share a few things that are brought up in the case with you. There are, of course, lots of issues. Many of them have been brought up by Michael Porter, but 3 issues are critical, and we want to point them out here as an introduction. The first issue relates to competitiveness, and we have talked a lot about it, and it needs to be discussed further. Because it's clear, not only from Michael Porter's work, but also from similar work in the EU, similar work at IMD in Switzerland, and other places, that Norway currently has a value creation which is disproportional to our competitiveness. And we need to discuss how to address the challenge of competitiveness. The second issue that we want to discuss is really how we leverage the strong positions we have today in Norway. It's been mentioned, but I think it needs to be elaborated somewhat. Norway has globally leading positions in several industries, and we know them. In addition to that, we have fast-growing new service and IT-based businesses. And I think it's interesting to just point out that when we go into the SkatteFUNN tax incentive database to look at how do Norwegian R&D projects look like within the oil sector or within the maritime sector, we find predominantly service and IT companies. So there's a very strong link between the new emerging clusters and the existing industrial positions in Norway. The third question, I think, is equally important, and it needs to be addressed. And that's, in a sense, the paradox of Norway. We have an incredibly high degree of formal education, it's been mentioned, but we can't find the same pattern within industry. We don't today have a knowledge-based and knowledge-intensive industry. And I think the third challenge that we want to bring out from the case is how can we convert this knowledge base into value creation going forward? Finally, I think the timing of this discussion is absolutely right. We are now in the process. We have an ambition, we have a vision stated by the government to become one of the most innovative countries in the world. We know it's possible. I think we demonstrate it's possible. For example, Snøhvit is probably the largest innovation project in Europe right now. But we need to spell out how to actually go from analysis and ideas to actions. And I think that's really where I want to introduce Michael Porter's second session, pointing out the question of what do we need to do and how do we need to do it. So please, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and I hope everybody had a good break. I certainly did. And it's a pleasure to be here with Torger and Knut and their colleagues. I'm sure others are here as well. I've had a very long and productive relationship with the Norwegian school, and look forward to a relationship for many years to come. And they have been partners in this effort to try to understand competitiveness in Norway and apply some of the work that we have been doing back at Harvard, and it's been a very, very fruitful partnership. We've learned a great deal from the Norway work that they have done, so I want to thank them for their contribution to the knowledge base in this field. I wish I could solve the case. I can't. I have a lot of ideas about what could be done differently and what needs to be done in Norway, and I'd like to share some of those with you, but I just want to tell you that I can't solve the case. You have to solve the case. Ultimately, competitiveness comes from within. It has to come from within. No outsider can actually make this happen. And so the real challenge, I think, is how can we move this debate to the point where there's, first of all, consensus on what needs to be done, and then consensus about the willingness to take action. And I think that is indeed maybe the most important challenge facing Norway of all. Now, again, time is short, so what I'd like to do is really start with where we left off in the first session, and talk and just remind you kind of what the overall diagnosis was, but then really move quite quickly to what do we do about it. And from my perspective, just to try to kind of wrap this into an overall framework for change, we've really identified 4 basic thrusts that are necessary on the competitiveness side. Now, that doesn't mean that the country doesn't need to do other things in other agendas. Competitiveness, as important as it is to me, I know it isn't everything. Having said that, in the competitiveness area, there really are 4 important agendas. Number 1, and probably the most important of all, is to address the barriers to productivity and innovation that exist in the economy. Basically, we've got to get the economy's level of productivity and innovation up to its potential and to the level that would support the standard of living and the rising standard of living. And there are 4 critical areas that we would stress, given the history and given the assessment of the strengths and weaknesses. Competition, internationalization, financial markets, and innovative capacity. And I'll talk more about each of those in terms of where it is that we think something needs to change. Secondly, we believe that although there's been a dialogue and debate about clusters in Norway for many, many years, and as Torger just said, there's been a lot of productive work done, there's still a sort of a hesitation to really embrace this philosophy. And it's really more than, it's not just a policy, it's a philosophy towards economic development, and actually put it into practice on the ground. I can tell you now that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cluster initiatives underway as we speak all over the world, in all the leading US regions, in Japan, all over the world. And I think the ability to go beyond the general policies and create a vehicle for business-government collaboration around particular fields, and we'll see later, it's not about picking winners, it's about all clusters, to advance the productivity and innovation agenda is proved to be a fundamental tool for economic development. And for some reason, we're still debating this in Norway rather than actually taking advantage of it. And so that's a second agenda item. And I realize that there's some issues with clusters that we need to take head on, and I'm going to do that later, but this is the second big thrust that I think is important. Thirdly, there's been a long tradition in Norway of concern for the outlying regions and a policy approach to addressing those regions, which I think historically has been unhelpful to competitiveness. In fact, one of the reasons that we see cluster development impeded is, to some degree, because of the regional policy. This is very common. This happens in a variety of countries. But I think we need to revitalize and rethink the approach to regional development within Norway, because as we learn about competitiveness and as we study more economies, we get increasingly struck by how local it is, by how the nation is important and national policies are important, but it's actually local initiative in each city, in each rural region that really determines the success or the failure of an economy. China isn't winning as much because of China. It's winning because of Shanghai. It's winning because of the area around Hong Kong. It's winning because regions are moving and people are taking initiative. And although Norway is a relatively small country, it's a very big country, and there's lots of people spread out. And we think that we need to ignite the energy of regions rather than frankly, cross-subsidized regions. And then finally, there's the real need, we believe, to shift the roles in economic development. This is another lesson that has emerged very, very strongly from the work that we've done all over the world. And that is that the nature of economic development is really different than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Government can't do it. Government doesn't have the expertise to do it. It doesn't have all the tools to do it. Government can't create wealth. Companies have to create wealth. The private sector has to create wealth. But in order for that to happen well, the private sector has to take some responsibility and be actively involved in the process. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, we could talk about many, many things in this session, but these are the 4 areas that I'd like to focus on and stress, because I think these areas contain, I think, some of the most important elements that if we could make some progress here over the next few years, it would, I think, almost certainly lead to some exciting progress. Okay, well, let's first talk about competition. I talked earlier about really the vital importance of competition in any competitive economy. If you look at Japan, where is Japan really competitive? Well, they're competitive in cars, and they're competitive in cameras, and they're competitive in robots, and they're competitive in consumer electronics. All of the areas where Japan is competitive are areas where there's a lot of competition. And the same is true in the US, and the same is true in virtually every economy in the world, big or small. Where's Singapore strong? They're strong in disk drives, where there's a lot of competition. They're strong in logistical services, where there's a lot of competition. You need to support active competition within your country if you're going to be competitive with other countries. That's the lesson of now more than a decade of work. Norway has some weaknesses in this area. Number one, again, it's not so much that government-owned companies are inherently bad, but if you have too much of that in your economy, it really makes it hard to develop the competitive vitality. And again, we see this all around the world. So this is an area which, again, has been much debated, but I think, at least in the direction of change, we ought to be trying to pull government out of the direct ownership of companies unless there's a really, really good reason. So in providing public services and competing in many industries, we want to pull government out, particularly in those industries where a lot of small and medium-sized firms could grow up to meet the demand that government firms are now serving. And often when you privatize or put activities into the private sector, you may start with a public monopoly, but what you want to end up with is private competition. So rather than just sell a government firm to somebody else who will then have a dominant position, you want to privatize in a way that stimulates more competition. And again, there's many good examples of that have been successfully carried out around the world. Norway has a relatively small market. Norway has been very, very clear about installing the appropriate competition policies, antitrust type policies, really staying at the level of the EU as a whole, even though you're not really formally part of that legal structure. However, we believe that when you're a small economy, you've got to be even more sensitive to any restrictions or barriers to competition than if you're a large economy, because you simply can't support this lack of rivalry. And at minimum, you have to be completely open to international competition, because that's the only market discipline that you're going to really have in many industries to really stimulate productivity and efficiency. Now, there are many business people who, don't like necessarily, at least in the beginning, the idea of being open to international competition. It's uncomfortable. You feel like you're going to lose control. You feel like you're going to lose your, some, critical assets because they'll not be able to compete. But I guess what you've got to realize is first of all, if Norwegian firms were more open to international competition, I bet a lot that Norwegian firms would be more international. There's kind of it kind of goes both ways. If you're more open and you have to compete internationally with firms from the outside, you tend then to be more oriented and compete outside. And remember, one of the things we talked about was that the internationalization of Norwegian firms was too low. Well, I think one of the reasons is that there hasn't been this outside pressure, this outside stimulus that has really stimulated the internationalization process. Any country that thinks that it can save its firms by not allowing them to face international competition is simply dreaming. You can't save your firms. The firms are going to compete or not compete. And the only way you actually can be sure you're going to impact yourself by protecting yourself from international competition is you're just going to raise the cost for every Norwegian. Because if a company doesn't have to meet international standards, that means that the Norwegian consumers of that company, whether they're businesses or individuals, are going to not have products and services that meet international standards. And that's not good. Again, that was the big mistake of Japan. Japan focused on the export sector and ignored the domestic sector, ignored the sheltered sector that was really protected, the agriculture, the medical health area, and many industries in Japan were sheltered, and they didn't succeed. And even though they weren't export sectors and they weren't counted on to be export sectors, they ended up undermining the export sectors. So again, there's a lot of emotion and a lot of passion and a lot of ideology, frankly, that gets mixed up in these discussions of internationalness and openness and privatization. I would just encourage Norwegians to think about it in very simple terms. Let's think in terms of productivity and our ability to have a standard of living in the future that we like. And I think if you keep focusing on what's productive and what will actually meet the test of the marketplace, then I think that makes some of these issues, I think, a lot clearer than if we start to debate whether international ownership is good or bad or whatever. Okay, I think a lot of countries get stuck in these debates that don't go anywhere and sort of forget the basics. And it's really common sense, you know. If you don't have productivity, how could you possibly expect that you're going to have prosperity? And so we've got to start to hopefully get past some of these old debates. Okay. In terms of internationalization, there are still far too many barriers to tariff and non-tariff barriers to imports here in Norway. Again, it's caught up in this effort to shelter Norway or protect Norway from what are often perceived as harsh and maybe even uncomfortable or unfair forces of international competition. I can tell you that it never succeeds. Eventually the powers of the international economy is just too great. You can't force Norwegians to live in Norway. You can't force Norwegian companies to be in Norway. It's just this is an international world we live in, and Norwegians are very international people. So we've got to be able to trust our own capability to compete and not get hung up in these old arguments. It's very clearly communicated to the outside world that Norway is not open for business. That is, Norway does not welcome foreign investment. This is the image the country has, and that's one of the reasons why the level of investment is so low, and there's a reason for that image. There's a history behind that image. And this image needs to change, certainly in my view. Again, what we find is who owns the company is much less important than what the company does in Norway. If you can get world-class technology companies operating in Norway, if you can get world-class financial companies operating in Norway, that's going to make you more competitive. That's going to make you more productive. That's going to employ a lot of Norwegian citizens in world-class organizations. And that's a good thing. So we've got to somehow have a campaign to change our image. Because if we don't change that image, we're going to have, I think, we're going to face a weakness. Norway needs to become more attractive as a place for entrepreneurs, for investors, for managers, for researchers. Again, no country can be self-sufficient anymore. So what you want to encourage to come to your country is smart people who can do interesting things. Researchers, entrepreneurs, managers. And, you know, Norway doesn't make it easy. It's easier to get into Norway as a refugee than it is as a PhD world-class physicist. It really is. And I mean, yeah, I understand how we want to be concerned about, you know, the massive influx of low-wage labor. And that's certainly, I think, a very legitimate national policy position, but I think to impede the flow of really talented people that are really great scientists or engineers or entrepreneurs, to make that hard, why would we want to do that? You know, how do we benefit from that? The answer is we don't. It's just some kind of old idea that if we don't, you know, kind of maintain the island, you know, then somehow things will go badly. Well, you know, I think we're underestimating ourselves and underestimating what our society can cope with. In terms of financial markets, the financial markets are very transparent, and there's a lot of good things about our financial markets. The good transparency, good protection of minority rights, all these things are real challenges in a variety of financial markets. But our financial markets are really not that sophisticated. Part of the reason is that we still are worried about having international financial firms, you know, openly operating here. I guess we're afraid they're going to swallow our own firms. But I think we need both. And that's what we see in a lot of other countries, and life goes on, and things get better. So I think we need to open our market to leading financial services firms, particularly in the business side, particularly in private equity, particularly in really business financing, various kinds of vehicles for efficient financing of businesses and risk-taking and that kind of stuff. Government has a lot of capital invested. Part of it is in the Norway fund, the oil fund, but a lot of government money is actually invested in Norway. And we think that there's a lost opportunity for government to actually stimulate the development of the financial market by being a demanding customer for financial services. So for example, you know, if government is setting out tenders for companies in new investment vehicles, that then will stimulate the growth of expertise in those new investment vehicles in Norway, and maybe that could build into an expertise that could be a broader, more international expertise. Instead of that, I think the Norwegian government money invested in Norway is invested in pretty, you know, simple vehicles, not innovative, not pushing the envelope, not cutting edge. I'm not talking about the government, you know, taking huge risks. I'm talking about the government simply having a goal that, look, if we're going to invest money in Norway anyway, we might as well insist that it's managed with world-class techniques and technology and vehicles and new forms of securities and the kind of thing that give you the vitality that makes your economy more dynamic and reduces the cost of capital to firms. So I think there's a lost opportunity there. Hopefully government can start to modify its thinking. In the area of innovation, there's been an enormous amount of discussion of innovation in Norway, and a lot of positive things have been proposed. and to some extent implemented. There's another part of the work that I've done drawing from the data in the Global Competitiveness Report, which is to attempt to measure innovative capacity and kind of what creates innovative capacity. And you see on this slide the kind of chunks of issues that go into innovation, which draw very much from the diamond theory and the cluster theory. Norway's Innovative Capacity Index, and this is based on last year's GCR because we did not publish this report this year for lack of time. Norway ranked 21, so it's remember this growth ranking is 6. GDP per capita ranking is 1 or 2. Growth is 6. Competitiveness is 20. Innovative capacity is 21. So again, a gap. The innovation capacity is significantly lower than the level of prosperity demands. Scientists and engineers, we look good there. We got a lot of scientists and engineers. Number 7 among all the countries. But in terms of the ability to connect those scientists and engineers and deploy them in the private sector in innovative activity, which we call the linkages index, there we're down at 20. That relates to the connection between universities and research institutes and the private sector, the fluidity of those relationships. I mean, I live in Boston where we have MIT. And at MIT, there's this inextricable connection between the university and the entrepreneurs and the private equity industry. And there's just this symbiosis that spits out companies, hundreds of them, while feeding in resources that regenerate MIT's research budget and excite and energize their scholars and researchers. In Norway, we are not nearly as well equipped and well organized to pursue that kind of relationship. Surprisingly, Norway's innovation policy mix is not particularly competitive. Yes, we do protect intellectual property and we have other policies that support innovation, but in general, we are not particularly pro-innovation in our policy mix. Companies, operations, and strategies are not particularly innovation driven. It's the spending, it's the orientation. Again, all these data come again from our surveys of leaders all around the world. And the cluster part of innovation is very important. Innovation tends to spit out of clusters. Because you think of a cluster as kind of a critical mass. And when you can get all the pieces in one place, then you get sort of the chain reaction. And part of that chain reaction is innovation. People have new ideas, they see a need, they see a demand, they learn something, they spit out an innovation. And here, because we have not really worked heavily on clusters, we've been hesitant to actually apply this concept. Our ranking based on objective survey data is relatively low. Now there's been some recent initiatives, a lot of policies. You all know this. I wrote this down mostly for myself. There has been a new innovation policy launched. A lot of these things are moving in the right direction. The question is, will we actually implement them? Will we deliver on the vision here? And I think that the vision is pretty good. We need to deliver on it. And that's a question of political will, of the ability of the government and the private sector to actually work together with universities to do these things forcefully over the coming years. There's also been some shifts in intellectual property to encourage patenting of academic research. That's very important. You know, there's a point of view that academic research should be the property of the state. And what we find is when that happens, it stays right where it is, in the academy. If the inventor and the university are motivated actually to patent that technology and deploy it, and are active in that process and have the motivation to be active in that process because they can actually benefit from it, then you see a lot better deployment of the academic research. So I think these changes are very positive and need to be continued. The notion of centers of excellence, is very important, and it's very closely linked to the notion of clusters. I'll talk about it a little bit later. When you're setting a national science and technology policy or a national innovation policy, it's a mistake just to kind of do cross-the-board thinking. I mean, a country like Norway is never going to be at the top in all fields of science and technology. You've got to figure out where you have some strength and where you can build on that strength. And, of course, if you can find crucial areas of cross-cutting importance that you have no strength in, then you got to maybe build that strength. So a good example of that would be in IT. I mean, any country that doesn't have some real strength in IT is in big, big trouble because IT is one of those cross-cutting technologies that affects virtually all sectors of the economy. So the notion that we are thinking more in terms of building centers of excellence rather than just pumping out resources across the board, I think is a real good step forward. R&D tax credits, more available, I think is a very, very good move. Why do you need R&D tax credits? Because firms can't capture many of the benefits of their R&D only for themselves. To say it another way, the benefits to the economy and to the business environment of R&D in the corporate sector are greater than is actually captured by any individual firm in its products and processes. It's what an economist would call an externality. So there's really quite a strong theoretical argument for R&D tax credits, and it's a way, it's neutral. Any company that's willing to come up with a great idea, that's willing to put their money in trying to come up with good ideas, that's to be encouraged. And that's particularly useful in an economy like Norway, where we're trying to make this transition to a higher knowledge intensity competition. Now, there's also been an effort and discussion, and I believe the minister talked about this, of launching government-financed seed capital funds in a number of cities. I think the notion that these seed capital funds should somehow have some relationship to universities, which is part of this policy, is a good idea. I think the real challenge, however, is how this is specifically implemented. I have not seen any government seed capital funds run by the government successful. Just haven't seen one. I may have missed one, but I've looked at a lot of them. I've seen a lot of seed capital funds operated by seed capital venture investors do well. So I think the question is really how to implement this, and how to make sure that you have world-class private equity and venture expertise investing that money with a lot of motivation to make money. The funds that say, well, we'd be satisfied with this return when the private market return is this, they never work. They do bad deals. They get too affected by politics. You've got to get the best talent, and you've got to motivate the talent to make a lot of money. The way for private equity funds to work is that the private equity investors have to get wealthy. And if we got a hang up about that, we got to get over it, because that's the only way this actually works. You've got to give people some motivation if they're going to take these big risks. A good seed capital fund is going to have one success and 5 failures, and that's going to be good. You've got to create the right incentives and the right motivation. So hopefully, government is going to put its money into world-class funds based in Norway that are managed by world-class people, and hopefully, government's going to have a competition to place these funds so that these entities can form, and you can stimulate a private equity industry in Norway that will then go out and look for partnerships with firms around the world who can help them and bring them expertise. Here's an example of how foreign investment wins. What if you have a couple of Norwegian guys or women who have some financial services background, they want to start a private equity fund, they want to be part of this seed capital program. So say they go out to a leading venture firm in Boston and say, would you help us? Maybe put some money in our company. Do we want to discourage that? Of course we don't. So this is what foreign investment is like. Don't think of it as somebody coming in and swallowing up your big companies. Think of it as all these little opportunities to learn and get expertise and talent and capital from the centers of innovation around the world. That's what it's all about. And we've got to make that happen. We've got to figure out how to grease that process. I also believe, and it's not on the slide, I also believe that we need to make a concerted effort in Norway to kind of develop the skills and capacity and orientation around entrepreneurship and new business development. I know the BI, the Norwegian school, is got an entrepreneurship curriculum, but this is a really important area. 20 years ago at Harvard Business School, we didn't have this, and our graduates all went into big companies, or consulting firms or investment banking. For the last 15 or so years, we've had a thriving, vibrant entrepreneurship, private equity, risk capital curriculum. And we have a whole segment of our students that take those courses and learn the latest techniques and the ways of thinking about business creation and business growth. And a tremendous now segment of our student population is now going into these companies. In fact, a lot of them are actually starting the companies during their second year of the Harvard MBA. And we actually have business plan competitions, and they can take a course and get credit for doing the business plan for the company that they're in the process of starting. So again, I think this is a cultural change, but it starts with, I think, young people and giving them a different perspective on what could be possible for them than just kind of taking the track into the safer careers that perhaps they've taken in the past. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about cluster development. We've already covered the general theory and why clusters matter. They matter because they stimulate more efficient business activity. If you've got your suppliers nearby, you don't need to hold so much inventory. It's easier to work with them. The knowledge exchange works better. Clusters stimulate and enable innovation. We've talked about that. Clusters also facilitate commercialization. If you want to start a shipping-related company in Norway, it's easy because there's a cluster already here. It's easy to find the skilled people. It's easy to find financing because people kind of understand that. It's easy to get the relevant technology. You can find some early customers. It's easy to start a company in a cluster. If you're off by yourself and you're trying to start a company in some entirely new field, it's really hard. So clusters are not just engines of productivity and engines of innovation, but they're also engines of new business formation. Very powerful influence on economic development. What we see as we look at every economy is that clusters tend to geographically concentrate in individual areas because that facilitates all the things that clusters do. If you can co-locate, you get the cluster benefits amplified. This just is a map of the United States, and I think that sometimes Europeans need to know just how different each region of the United States is in terms of what the economy is. It's like the Boston economy is completely different than the economy of New York and Connecticut, who are neighbors. And there's a lot of specialization around clusters where that region can build up unique assets and unique strengths. And this map kind of gives you kind of a schematic view of that. We've actually started to be able to do some quantitative work, mostly so far in the United States because the data is the best there, that really demonstrate the important role of clusters in wages, in new business formation, in innovation. This simply shows that how the average regional wage in a particular region, and these little dots are all regions of the United States, the average regional wage is higher where a bigger part of your economy is in clusters than in an economy that's very diverse. And it's quite a strong relationship, particularly given that that's the only variable we're measuring here. If you look at a multiple regression controlling for a number of factors, you can explain even more of the differences across regions. This chart is a little bit complicated, but these are US states. And what we found is that the US states that are becoming more concentrated around a series of clusters have faster wage growth. And again, you don't want just one cluster in your economy. You want an array of clusters, but the point is that you don't want just a little bit of everything. That doesn't work. You're not very productive if you have just a little bit of everything. You want a good, strong core of a series of clusters that give you the capacity really to be productive and innovate at a rapid rate. And what we've learned, and this is something that I think Torger may have said a minute ago, what we've learned is that the way to grow clusters is to make your existing clusters more advanced. Because new clusters grow out of old clusters. That's the way it often works. You know, how did Japan get into robotics? Well, because they were making cars. How did Japan get into VCRs? Well, because they were making TV sets. You can trace most clusters. If you go back in their history, there were seeds there that were sown in other clusters or in some historical natural resource positions. So again, clusters, we find the data is now pretty compelling that there's a clear linkage between clusters and prosperity. I don't think that is something we should debate. Clusters are indeed crucial engines of economic development, of innovation. But I think what's often misunderstood is that really a lot of the benefits of clusters come in the working relationships that develop when you get people in a cluster involved in a process of self-introspection and with an orientation towards change. How do we make things better? Clusters prove to be, all over the world, a forum where you can actually identify challenges that have to be addressed in the business environment. Again, the cluster vehicle allows very specific, specialized challenges to be identified that a government could just not understand unless they had the active participation of the private sector folks that were involved in the cluster. Now remember, when we talk about a cluster, we're not just talking about the firms that make the end product. We're talking about all the suppliers, the financial services providers, the logistical companies. So a cluster is a very diverse group of players. And when you can kind of mobilize them to think and reflect on their challenges, you learn very, very important things that it's very hard to learn other ways. Also, the cluster is a vehicle to get business and government and universities talking productively, not theoretically, but productively about what needs to change, what could be done. And therefore, it's the more relationship and process dimensions of clusters that are just as important, we find, as the actual kind of economic analysis. Just a very exhilarating case that I like to talk about in terms of cluster development is the case of Australia in wine. You all probably know that Australia has become one of the leading wine exporters in the world. And really, if you went back to 1990, Australian wine exports would be zero. Now, there's long been a wine industry in Australia. It has a pretty attractive topography and climatic conditions in certain parts of the country. There's long been wine. There's a long tradition of wine, but there was never any exports. There was never any competitiveness there. And I think some very visionary folks started talking and interacting in the 80s and in the early part of the 90s, and started to kind of come up with a sense of, okay, what do we need to put in place here to allow us to really be world class? It's not a matter of having a cartel. It's not a matter of collaborating so that you don't have to compete. It's a matter of using the cluster vehicle to identify the challenges, the constraints, the weaknesses that have to be addressed, and moving to address them. This is sort of a timeline of the development of the Australian wine cluster. You can see it goes back a long time. But when you hit the 80s and the 90s, you start to see a proliferation of new institutions and new organizations and new research institutes and new international marketing programs that really put Australia into the position where they could become one of the leading innovators in wine production and grape cultivation. And then they were able to build this incredible international brand. They came up with this Shiraz product, which, and a lot of the Australian wine companies, although they compete like hell, they all understood that this Shiraz thing would give them kind of an Australian, made in Australia type signature, and off they went. And look at that, $1 billion of exports, more than $1 billion now, from nothing. That accounts for a significant part of Australia's export growth over the last 20 years. Now, obviously I'm a strong believer in clusters. What I've tried to give you is the reasons why, both kind of conceptually and also from a data point of view. But I do realize that there is some controversy about clusters, and the controversy is usually this. There's the perception that clusters are somehow a way of biasing the economy. That they're not, that clusters mean that you're not neutral. And clusters also are sometimes seen as a vehicle for collusion, not competition. Okay? So let's take those arguments on head on. Okay? On the second one, if the cluster process is about setting prices, if it's about dividing markets, if it has anything to do with marketplace competition, and if the effort is in any way limiting market competition, indeed the cluster effort is going to be a disaster. But of those hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of cluster efforts going on in the world, there are almost none of them that are like that. The real purpose of a cluster effort is not to focus on market competition. It's to focus on the underlying infrastructure that all the members of the cluster draw upon. And things like the human resource pool. Things like the science and technology infrastructure. Things like the logistical systems necessary to move goods and services. Good cluster efforts really focus on the enabling environment. Companies realize that they have a common set of challenges and problems in those areas and realize that it's a lot more effective to address those problems through the cluster than it is for each company to try to address those problems simply on its own. Let's take training. You know, a company can train all of its people that hires them. That's expensive. Wouldn't it be better if there could be a high-quality training program, very specialized to the needs of that cluster, that all the companies could draw on? Government can spend the money to try to motivate companies to train people, but we find it's much more cost-effective if government spends its money on figuring out what people need to be trained to do by understanding what clusters and what needs they have. So it's really, you know, do you look at government policy as really supply-driven or demand-driven? Too much government policy is supply-driven. Oh, let's do some more training. The cluster approach says, how can we make it more demand-driven? So for each cluster, what are the specialized needs? Are there adequate programs? If not, let's fix them. Let's get them in place. That's what the cluster approach is all about. It's really about the enabling environment. Now, on the neutrality point, I think that we are getting a little bit confused between kind of old-style industrial policy and what clusters are really all about. And I think given the language in Europe, this slide may not be ideal, because I think for you, industrial policy is a general term that means, what do you do about your industry? To us in the United States, the word industrial policy means a very specific thing. It means kind of old-style intervention, national champions. We're going to try to subsidize certain sectors that we deem to be important. And so when I say industrial policy, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a kind of wildly discredited way of trying to grow your economy, which fundamentally is about distorting and getting in the way of competition. And you can read the points. Cluster policy is very different. It couldn't be more different. First of all, cluster policy starts with the presumption that all clusters are good. Let me just repeat that. All clusters are good. There's not some clusters that are better than others. All clusters allow the improvement of productivity. All clusters are worthy of enhancement and upgrading. Okay, so that's point number one. There's no picking here. Now, there's a reality that some clusters in your country are more competitive and other clusters are less competitive, but that doesn't mean we focus on the more competitive ones and don't pay attention to the uncompetitive ones. There can also be clusters that are local. Restaurants. You can have an entertainment cluster in Oslo. And getting those entertainment organizations and those hospitality organizations together to think about, okay, what are our constraints? What's standing in the way of us being higher quality, more productive, is just as valid as working on shipping. So a cluster is completely neutral in terms of, all clusters are good. Any cluster that wants to improve itself, great. We should support that. Clusters are about building on strength. Building on existing assets. We find that economic development works best where you're actually building on strength, rather than trying to create something that doesn't exist because you've got this theory that it's a good idea. And as I said earlier, new clusters tend to grow out of old clusters, rather than from completely left field, from out of nowhere. Again, that's a very, very important part of the cluster philosophy. The whole idea of cluster-based policy is to raise the plane of competition, to improve the enabling environment, to allow companies to get better inputs in terms of skill, technology, logistics, and so forth. Not to subsidize. Subsidize is the old-style stuff. It's clear that if you subsidize a company, it's probably not going to ever have to be really competitive itself, so it won't be. You don't want to subsidize the company, but both public and private sectors need to make investments in the underlying infrastructure of an economy, and the cluster vehicle provides a way of making those investments more productive. So let's take another example. So suppose you want to have a science and technology policy. So what do? Just set up laboratories and tell them to go out and publish papers? No, you're much better off, although you need a basic scientific infrastructure on basic science in your university system. If you want to set up technical institutes, you're going to get much more value if you set up those technical institutes in areas where they're clusters and where the private sector is expected to participate in the financing of those institutes, not just the government. So again, cluster thinking allows you to get a bigger return on public investments, not just private investments. This is an example of what cluster development really looks like. This is the case of Minnesota in medical devices. I won't read through all these points, but it's very much of a collaborative process of business and government figuring out what needs to be done to move the cluster to more advanced ways of competing. Each company is still going to have to compete. Each company has its own strategy. Each company does whatever it wants. But we're talking about raising the plane that everybody is on, some of the challenges need to be addressed by government. And so one of the things that a good cluster effort does is government has to listen, and if government will listen, it can make more useful policies. The other thing that happens, though, is the private sector does a lot of things itself. In this particular case of Minneapolis, the cluster association actually created a series of educational programs working with the local universities and vocational schools that were critically missing in that region. How did they? And they didn't wait for government. They didn't need government. They just did it. But they did it collectively through their industry association rather than each company trying to, in a fragmented way, get something to happen. And of course, when the industry association went to the college and said, we're interested in this, and there were 20 or 30 companies involved, and they were all saying, gee, if you provide these kind of people, we'll hire them. The college all of a sudden says, whoa, that sounds interesting. That's what I'm here to do. I'm here to train my graduates to get jobs. And so look at how that process really happened, but it didn't require government at all. So I think some people have this notion that clusters are just a way of favoring certain sectors and subsidizing them at the expense of others. Really, as kind of the author of this, I can tell you that's not what we think, and that's not what we've written. Now, the fact that some governments and some individuals tried to kind of hijack clusters as a vehicle for subsidy, for making the case for subsidy, I think that's unfortunate. And that unfortunately happens to a lot of ideas. They get used sometimes in ways that that were not intended. But believe me, it's these kind of things that we're talking about when we're talking about cluster development. So I don't think we can get hung up in this neutrality thing. I understand and believe in the absence of favoring and subsidy for specific sectors, because I think that is a mistake and it doesn't work, and all the evidence is clear on that. But the idea that government should have an active role in both identifying and convening and then supporting the improvement of virtually every cluster it can possibly help in the economy, I think that's very different and very much appropriate. And there's really a symbiosis between the upgrading the business environment and cluster enhancement. These two reinforce each other. So we need to think about it that way. Now, in terms of regional development, there have been some policy changes here in Norway, and I think policies are generally moving in the right direction. But the basic problem is that you can't try to artificially stimulate activity in outlying regions. You can try, but the only way you're going to do that through subsidy is you're just going to have an unending subsidy. The only way that you can really stimulate economic activity in outlying regions that's sustainable is you need to essentially equip regions and charge regions with the necessity of figuring out how to build on whatever areas of strength they have into a viable economic base. And clusters are often part of that analysis. You can't, if you try to subsidize activity, you'll get uncompetitive activity. Instead, what you need to be trying to do is improve the business environment in selected areas to make it very attractive to do business, fundamentally attractive from a productivity point of view in certain areas. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but I know that much of Norway is very rural. And we have recently completed a major study, a report on the competitiveness of rural areas. And the next slide simply reproduces some summaries of some of the findings from that report, and there's a citation. We would encourage any of you that are interested in rural development. There's a new philosophy needed to rural development. It tends not to work around the world, but it can work if we, again, approach it with a different perspective. Now, in terms of the roles of government and other entities, basically the transition that's happening is this. In the old thinking about competitiveness and development, government drives the game. The central government in the national capital is really running the show, and everybody else kind of is a consumer of economic policy and competitiveness policy. In the new model, it's a collaborative process. Business and government are talking a lot because otherwise, how's business going to know, how's business going to be able to inform government about what's really wrong, about what specific things it really needs help on in terms of regulatory streamlining or critical skill shortages or critical knowledge shortages. It's a process where government is not just the national governments involved, but local and regional governments are responsible and are charged with delivering their own thinking and their own actions in terms of how to revitalize their areas, rather than just thinking that they should be getting checks, from the central government. It's a model where companies are not just sitting back and complaining. Companies are actually doing things privately to enhance competitiveness, like that effort in Minneapolis to develop the necessary educational programs to fill the skill gaps. It's a model in which universities and educational institutions don't see themselves as sort of independent centers of higher learning, but they see themselves as integrally connected with the economy. And they realize that just like MIT, if you can build relationships with world-class firms, you're going to be better at what you do as a university, as a research center, as a teaching institution. So rather than fear connecting with the private sector, in the modern model, universities actually hunger it, not just because they're hoping for money, but because they're also hoping that this allows them to be world-class in certain areas in which they choose to try to be world-class. I've got a couple slides that really conclude the presentation about what are the various roles. In terms of the role of government, I try to lay out here that government has multiple roles in economic development. I think everybody understands the role in terms of macro, legal, social, and political development. The need for stability, the need for transparency, all those things I think are well known, and pretty much all countries are trying to do those. I think it's quite well understood that the government needs to work to improve the general business environment, both the assets available, like the infrastructure, as well as the incentives. I think there the mistake is that we got to make sure that we create the right incentives and use government's influence to play the right roles. And we've talked about that earlier in my presentation. But I think there's two other roles of government that many governments are still learning about. One is the importance of facilitating the cluster development agenda for all the reasons that I've mentioned just now. This has become really the next pillar of economic policy in certainly many parts of the world. And then I think the last role of government really is to sort of lead and trigger a collaborative process of dialogue and discussion and ultimately economic change. And I think in no country could that be more important than Norway. Citizens must learn the nature and reality of the modern international economy. Citizens must understand what it really takes to win. Citizens must understand what allows you to maintain a high standard of living. Citizens must understand what it takes to get a good wage and to earn that good wage. All parts of a society, given that we're all democracies now, have to understand and grasp these issues. There has to be some process by which citizens are informed, leaders come together, and in a thoughtful and objective way, these issues are discussed and consensus is reached, because otherwise you will get blocked when you start to try to implement some of these areas, because misunderstanding and concern about preserving the old ways of the past will really get in the way. There are a number of countries that are brilliant at this. I mean, I would cite Singapore as one. And Singapore, every 3 or 4 years, has a national process of self-reflection. It is page one news. There are huge national forums put in place where people from all walks of life participate. They're always saying, okay, what could we do better? Rather than starting the point of view of how can we defend what we're doing. And as a result, Singapore has been able to weather transition after transition after transition and continue to be a very prosperous economy. Well, these are my thoughts that I hope you will find helpful. They are thoughts that are all presented as a friend, not as a critic, not as the annoying American. I guess we Americans are increasingly annoying these days. But I believe that, to me, the directions in which Norway needs to move are not too complicated to understand. And the question really is, can we move? Can we reach consensus? Can we mobilize an energy? Can we really get Norway moving? That is a tall order, but I can tell you that you in this room right now, the private sector leaders, you have to do this. You can't expect government to lead this discussion. You can't expect, the average citizen to lead this discussion. You are the best informed, you are the most affected. The private sector in Norway has to step up and push this agenda. I've learned that if the private sector is really united about something, in any country, and if they're forceful, and if they communicate forcefully with their elected representatives and their political leaders, the private sector can energize change. So my challenge to you would be that let's get going. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Dear Michael, thank you for a great morning. I think you know Norway better than many Norwegian politicians. We do not have flowers for you, not even a bottle of aquavit, but we have a very special diploma. And this diploma shows the strong relationships between BI, the Norwegian School of Management, and you personally, and the Harvard Business School. And therefore, I would like our President, Torgeir Reve, to hand over the diploma.
In 2003, about 1 year ago, BI celebrated its 60th year's anniversary. In fact, it was a celebration of the entrepreneurship story of BI, starting from a very small start as an evening school for engineers studying management. And today it's a school with 20 campuses in 5 countries, serving more than 20,000 students. Now, the Academic Council at BI went to the very unusual move last year to award 3 honorary doctoral degrees. And we picked the 3 strongest subjects, 1 in finance, 1 in marketing, and 1 in strategy. Now, to find the right person is a very complicated problem in academia. But in strategy, it was an easy choice. Professor Michael Porter of Harvard Business School was awarded honorary doctorate degree in strategy. Michael has transformed the field of strategy from a very sort of simple checkbook approach almost to an economic-based discipline of large relevant to business. In addition, his research has contributed to very significant ways to our standing of innovation and industrial competitiveness, as we have heard today. When BI had its magnificent celebration in June 2003 at the Oslo City Hall, Michael Porter was stuck in the wilderness of South Africa with his family, and he had to participate in the celebration by satellite communication. So today I have the chance to hand you personally the doctoral diploma that you so clearly earned. So this is a doctor honoris causa in strategy and industrial competitiveness from BI.
Thank you very much. That's great. Well, Torger, thank you very much, and I'm very, very proud of this recognition, particularly at such a important moment in the history of the school, the 60th anniversary. I was indeed stuck in Africa because I had a long-standing trip planned with my daughters, and but Torger was kind enough to, we found a way to move forward anyway. This degree, I think, really has cemented for me what has been a very long and fruitful relationship with the school, dating back to the early 90s and the early work on competitiveness that I think was extraordinarily high-quality work. And I think that's a credit to Torger and his colleagues and the staff. As I've said before, I have learned about competitiveness from this school. And I've continued to learn. There was an update of that work in the latter part of the 90s, and I think it's an extraordinary, important role that the school is playing in the dialogue about competitiveness in Norway. And I hope that continues, and I'm very anxious to be involved. The school is also a leading center in strategy, as well as a number of other fields of management, where it not only is a good teaching institution, but is also creating real intellectual capital, being an innovator that is recognized increasingly internationally. So I think the school is the kind of world-class competitive entity that we want to see a lot more of in Norway. And the fact that I have this relationship and I've been honored in this way is simply going to make me even keener to do everything I can to help that. I also want to, on a personal note, just say that Torger is not a shy guy. He's not receding into the academic ivory tower and just doing his thing. He's a guy, and his colleagues are people that are out there trying to engage both in public policy and also with the business community. And I think, again, that's a model for what the new higher education institution has to do. So for a whole lot of reasons, I congratulate the school, but I'm also very proud to be honored in this way. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are you done? Thank you.